Welcome to the Think Act Be podcast. I'm Seth Gillahan. My guest this week is psychologist and author Dr. Jill Stoddard. Jill and I had a great discussion about feeling like an imposter, why it happens, who's likely to experience it, and most important, how to deal with those thoughts and feelings. The solution probably won't be what you expect, because the answer is not to force yourself to think and feel differently. Most of us find that our thoughts and feelings kind of have a mind of their own, and trying to make them change is often more frustrating than successful. So if you've wrestled with imposter syndrome, you'll find this conversation really helpful. Jill is a TEDx speaker, an award-winning teacher, and co-host of the popular Psychologist Off the Clock podcast. She's written 2 books in addition to her latest one, including one called Be Mighty, and the Big Book of Act Metaphors. Her writing has appeared many places, including The Washington Post. She's a regular guest on podcasts, and she serves as an expert for various media outlets. Jill lives in Massachusetts with her husband, her 2 kids, and her French bulldog. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and thanks for listening. Well, Jill, thanks for coming on the podcast and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Seth. I'm excited to be here with you.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time to talk with me about your latest book called Imposter No More, Overcome Self-Doubt and Imposterism to Cultivate a Successful Career. So maybe we can start and you can just describe for us. I mean, this is probably a familiar experience for most of us. It certainly is for me. But what is imposterism or imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So essentially, it is a feeling, an internal experience of feeling phony or feeling inadequate that exists and persists even when there's evidence to the contrary. So in other words, people who have this experience are often very bright, often very successful and accomplished, but they don't believe themselves to be, even though they have racked up many, many achievements. And so they're afraid that at any moment people will find out that they're not as competent as maybe you think they are, and that they'll be outed as a fraud or a fake.
Yeah, and as you discuss in the book, feeling like an imposter isn't necessarily a sign that you're not an imposter. Like sometimes, an important part of the definition is with all the evidence to the contrary of being an imposter. So if I showed up on the Phillies, the baseball team tonight and suggested I was going to play, I would truly be an imposter and an interloper. But that's an important distinction. One thing I wanted to ask you about, just while we're talking about terminology and definitions, is in the book you move away from imposter syndrome and talk about the imposter phenomenon. I noticed in you had a great recent article in Washington Post about this topic. There in the headline and throughout it was imposter syndrome. So I'm curious about I understand some of the rationale for taking out syndrome from something that seems like almost maybe this not universal but super common experience. But I wonder, are people who feel like imposters, are they upset by that name, or is it more us kind of academic types who worry like, oh, maybe it's too pathologizing or something? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to look at the origin of it being called a syndrome. So when this was first identified by 2 psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, back in 1978, they called it the imposter phenomenon. And at that time, they believed that it exclusively affected women, high-achieving women. And I don't think it's a coincidence in the late 70s, early 80s, that, some high-achieving, successful women who are experiencing self-doubt suddenly in our culture, that this got rebranded a syndrome. It was never intended to be a syndrome. And so I think that there's really this kind of unconscious or conscious, I'm not sure, bias, but that something that affected, these women are having self-doubt, this must be a disorder or a disease or a pathology. And so I think that that's really important to look at. And while the research is not entirely clear. There are hypotheses out there that I think make perfect sense. And whenever I do these interviews, I say, if any dissertation students are listening, someone study this. It would be a great dissertation. But, it seems possible that people who have had a history of marginalization may be more vulnerable to developing this, right? So, if you are a person of color who has been very clearly told you don't belong in white spaces for hundreds of years, or an LGBTQI person in straight cis spaces, or a disabled person in able-bodied spaces, et cetera, it stands to reason that you're going to question whether you belong at those tables when you've been told both explicitly and implicitly that these are not spaces that are open to you. And so that, in addition to the fact that it seems to be so prevalent, anything that's affecting half of us can't possibly be a pathology. And so I think it's just a misnomer, and I think it pathologizes something that really should not be pathologized. And then it also kind of puts the onus on the individual, like this is your disease or disorder or pathology that you need to fix, and really ignores the organizational and systemic influences.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, Jill, who tends to get imposter syndrome or experience the imposter phenomenon? Because from my reading early in your book, it seemed like there's maybe mixed evidence. There's certain theories about who's more likely to get it, as you were alluding to just now, but then in reality, the data may not always line up with that. So who's prone to getting imposter syndrome, and who is, or what's the prevalence? How common is it?
So we'll start with that question, which is an interesting one, because first of all, the science on this, to be honest, is just abysmal. If you do a Google search, you get hundreds of millions of hits, or maybe it's tens of millions, but it's a lot. If you do a search on PubMed or a scientific database, it's hundreds. And many of those are just correlational studies. There are a handful of well-designed studies that look at certain factors, but they're really, for how much we talk about this in the world, there is really not a lot of good science.
Yeah.
And so if you look at studies that simply look at prevalence, they widely vary. I mean, from 9% to 86% is the range that I have.
Wow.
So, the reality is we don't really know. But I suppose if you sort of take an average, you can assume that it's pretty darn common. And I would say I have found twice as many studies where the prevalence is above 40%. It's like 40 to 80%. And a smaller number of studies where the prevalence is in that much lower rate. And in terms of, who is more vulnerable to experiencing this is another question that's a scientific question that we don't have a scientific answer to. But in terms of hypotheses, I think that it is likely that there are probably three main contributors. And the first, I think, is evolution, honestly. I think that, given that it's possible that more than half of us experience this at some point in our lives, that this is something that was sort of created by design hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it makes sense if you think about the fact that early humans did not have sharp teeth or claws or run at high speeds. We had each other. And early humans who hunted and gathered and traveled together had a survival advantage. And if you were kicked out of your tribe, you were literally dead. So to develop an inner dialogue that is saying, do I measure up? Do I add value? Am I at risk of, my people wanting me to be around anymore? Are they going to find out that I'm maybe not as good as I'm purporting myself to be, or they think I am? So I think it's possible that it may have begun back then. And then I think if we look at we know that our early learning experiences influence us. If we've had highly critical parents, if we have had even, I talk in the book about how I think it's possible, we went from the 80s into the 90s into this kind of self-esteem era of praising your children and making sure that they feel good about themselves. And I suspect, if there's a part of you that knew that you didn't really deserve all of the praise that you were getting for even very minor accomplishments, that could be something that influences the development of this, just as likely as if you've grown up with maybe highly critical parents or bullies in your school that make you feel like you might be inadequate. And then, of course, the thing I mentioned before that I think, we can't ignore the social and cultural influences when it comes to people who have experienced marginalization.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting as I was thinking about my own experiences of imposterism and people that I've worked with clinically or just known. And it seems like there there are always things you can point to, as you were describing just now, maybe it's too much praise or not enough positive interactions with caregivers early in life. Maybe it's the societal setup and all those things are plausible. And at the same time, part of me wondered how much might those just be stories that we create after the fact to describe something that's a really common experience,
Yeah,
like
that's
I,
possible. Maybe it's
I,
all evolution and the rest is just stories that we're telling ourselves, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's an empirical question that really hasn't been answered.
yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting one. And studies that look at gender differences sometimes find that women experience this more frequently than men, and other studies find that that's not the case. And what I find myself wondering is if we compared men who have been marginalized, men and human beings who have been marginalized to human beings who have not been marginalized, that like really that's where we might end up seeing more of these differences than
Mm,
in gender. And there are plenty of straight, cis, white men who can certainly experience this too. If you're maybe a stay-at-home dad, where the majority of people, that are caring for their kids are moms or women. If you are an older person working in technology or athletics, there are plenty of places where, um, even separate from obvious experiences of like oppression or cultural kinds of uh, uh, marginalization, there are plenty of ways that people can feel like they don't measure up, they don't belong. I mean, I often think about like Pinterest parents, the Pinterest moms who are just like doing everything homemade and the birthday parties and the cakes and I walk in with my, grocery store cupcakes. And even things like that can trigger that experience of like, oh, I'm not as good of a mom as all of these other moms. And what am I really doing? And they're all going to figure out that you may not feel like exactly a fraud or an imposter, but kind of, right? Like I'm like
hmm
posing as this mom, but I'm really as good as all of these other people. So there's like no shortage of experiences that I think can trigger this for people depending on their context.
Yeah, yeah. And one more. I don't want to dig too deep on this because other things I want to ask you, but what about if there's just nothing to point to? I'm imagining maybe someone who looks a lot like me, who's straight. What's the acronym you use? WIMP, white
Yeah,
heterosexual
that
male.
was Dr. Janet Helms, WHMP, white heterosexual male of privilege. She called that. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no specific thing that a person can point to. Maybe a person's in technology and they're young, and they look like the poster child for someone who would have an easy time and in the that tech space, just for example. But I guess I don't. Again, these are empirical questions, but I wonder if that may be sort of like being depressed without anything to point to. It's like kind of a painful experience. Like, I know I shouldn't be depressed. It's like, well, I can't point to my disadvantaged childhood, or I had loving parents who didn't seem to praise me too much, but also were loving and present, and I'm guessing you see cases of imposterism in those situations too, where there's nothing kind of
I
obvious.
I mean, I wouldn't say that there's nothing that you can't point to, but even the things we're pointing to are still hypotheses, right? It's as mental health professionals, we don't get to do a blood test, right? And say,
Mm,
oh, you have this problem. Like we conceptualize what we think might be at the heart of what's going on. But honestly, I wanted to write about this in the book, but in my practice, I spend very little time on this because,
yeah.
I someone shared a metaphor once that they think about therapy as, if you're driving your car and you get a flat tire, you could get out of the car and spend a whole lot of time walking back trying to figure out exactly what caused the flat tire. And that
Mm,
might be useful if you find the nail and you can remove it and prevent it from happening again. But like, really, we want to be able to like put on the spare or put on the new tire and get the car back on the road. And that really is sort of the place that I practice from. And it does not mean I ignore the past. I 100% assess it thoroughly, and it influences my conceptualization. But the way I really look at it is, in what ways have your learning, your early learning experiences resulted in like things that press your buttons in the current moment? And how does that keep you stuck in the current moment? But I don't spend, too much time trying to figure out exactly why someone feels like a fraud, because at the end of the day, we can't really know for sure. It's all just a hypothesis.
Right.
But we
Yeah.
can certainly help get them back on the road so that it's holding them back from opportunities. Or the opposite I find happens maybe more often is getting on that hamster wheel of like achieve, trying to outrun this experience, which of course doesn't work.
And why not? I think that's a good segue. Why is, if someone has some degree of success, but they feel like a fraud, why is more success typically not the answer to imposterism?
It's such an interesting question, and it's really the thing that got me the most interested in this. Is I sort of, in my own life, I could understand why I might feel this way when I got into a competitive grad school or started, was at the beginning of my career, and thought for sure once I racked up enough achievements, maybe once I do a TED Talk, then I'll feel like I'm legitimate. And it just doesn't really happen. And, from what I can tell, again, not a question we have a scientific answer to, but hypothetically, what people have posed is essentially the more you achieve, the more you're expected to know.
Right.
Right? So like the mail clerk and the CEO are expected to have different levels of knowledge. And so that sort of pressure to be adequate, competent, skillful increases the more that you have sort of behind you. If I haven't written a book yet, of course it makes sense that I feel sort of like a fraud. I'm not really a book author, and I'm going to go write a book. And then, I don't know, after 3 books, I reached out to a woman on Twitter who had written, I think, 27 books. And even she still had this experience. 27 books.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just not the answer. More is not the answer.
More is not the answer.
I remember, Jill, this would have been maybe 17 years ago. It was the night of my dissertation defense. So I successfully defended my dissertation in 2006. And then my dissertation advisor and a group of us went out to this place for like this chocolate place to celebrate with champagne and strawberries and stuff. So I remember sitting there, and with this grin plastered on my face, but inside just feeling sick, like I had just tricked everybody. Like, and going through like the publications that had been a part of my dissertation, like, well, yeah, but that one was, small samples, so probably not, reliable with different survivors of strokes. Going just through all of them, reason you got dismiss. Oh my God, like this is all just like a farce. So yeah, we shouldn't be surprised that then climbing the next rung is not going to probably be any different.
Yeah. And I think part of it too, maybe that we seem to have this human tendency to compare up rather than down. It's
right.
We don't naturally go, wow, look how much I've accomplished compared to other people at my level who maybe haven't done as much. It's, well, but I mean, I'm no Steve Jobs, or I'm no, it's like we tend to look at all of the people who have won Nobel Prizes or these insane, top 0.01% things. So, I think there's always that we could always be quote unquote better or more accomplished. And so it just doesn't, it doesn't solve that feeling of inadequacy.
Yeah.
And there's always more we could know. So it also doesn't solve that problem of fraudulence. They'll find out I don't know everything. Well, of course you don't know everything. Nobody knows everything, but that's how our brains work.
No. You also describe how we don't feel like imposters about everything, that it shows up in certain domains of our life. Where in our life does it tend to show up the most?
Well, I think it shows up where we care the most, right? I tell a story in the book that's it's silly, but it's 100% true, that when they say it's just like riding a bike, meaning if you do something after not doing it for a while, it comes right back to you and it's very easy. Well, I hadn't ridden a bike for 10 years and I got on my bike and I immediately crashed. So riding a bike was not just like riding a bike for me. And I spent literally no time worrying about this because I simply don't care about my bicycle riding prowess.
Right.
But it triggered all these thoughts about how my kids were 7 and 9 or 8 and 10, and neither of them knew how to ride a bike yet. And I felt like a really bad mom. And I
Mhm.
cared deeply about being a mother. And so I think if people look at the places where they most worry they're going to be found out, that everyone's going to figure out that they're not that competent, it's in these areas that matter. If you want to make a contribution, if you want to be a team player, if you want to be competent and skillful, if these things really matter to you, then this is where this stuff will show up. But you can see that, I think, more powerfully when you look at all the places you don't spend time worrying, right? If you think
Mhm.
about the last time you were sitting up at 2 a.m. with your wheels spinning, you're not fretting about the fact that there's never going to be a season 4 of Ted Lasso, even if that was your favorite show ever,
Right.
right? Because it's,
Right.
even though you might love it and care about it, it's like not that thing that deeply matters to you in terms of your values.
Yeah. You know, going back to the idea of just doing more, I wanted to ask you about a passage from your book. You're describing some of your own experience, and you write, "I tried to juggle one too many balls on my own, and they eventually all came crashing down." What happened when they crashed down?
Well, I'm not sure exactly which which passage that is, but that is an experience that I did have. And um, when they came crashing down, I was burnt out. I felt like I
Mm.
had so much to do and not enough time to do it. And up until that, I'd always been a pretty busy, high achieving person. And I would have a mantra: it'll get done. It always does. And that was true. And that would help me to just sort of soldier on. But at one point, it all just got to be too much. And um, what's added to that, that I don't remember if this is in the part that you're reading about, but I was also someone who sort of developed a behavioral strategy of kind of, I call it, I'm going to independence and competence my way through everything. And, didn't feel like I could ask for help. This was like a defense that I had, that if you ask people for help, they'll let you down. You need to just figure it out and do everything on your own. And so when everything came crashing down and I really needed to ask for help, I was stuck because I just didn't, that felt like it was something that was really hard for me. I didn't know who to go to. I didn't know how to ask. Um,
Mm.
so I was at a bit of a loss at that time.
Yeah. And as you describe throughout the book, these strategies we have, these ways we try to compensate when we feel like an imposter, we tend to do them because they work until they don't.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that was your sort of path to finding what worked and then didn't. What what is helpful? Because I think you talk about how you see all these articles about, how to fix your imposterism, or get rid of those feelings of being an imposter, or stop feeling like an imposter in 5 steps. Or is that the solution? And if not, what works?
Yeah. Well, I think if people are able to do that, if you find a way to boost your confidence and feel great about yourself, wonderful. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there are lots of books that are written to try to help people to do that. But in my experience, I have never once encountered a person who has said, "Oh, I read this book or I did these 5 steps and now I don't have self doubt anymore. It worked. I'm cured." I just haven't seen it.
Mm-mm.
Um, so the type of therapy that I do as a clinician is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And the main goal for that is psychological flexibility, which is kind of, instead of trying to strong arm our thoughts and feelings into being positive or feel good or the way that we think we want them to be, we change our relationship to them. So we can notice that we're having these imposter thoughts. We can notice that we're feeling anxious or filled with self-doubt or dread, whatever the feeling may be that we don't like, and make space for those things. To use, you're a mindfulness expert, right? So mindfulness is a big part of this, that if we can be mindfully aware of our internal experiences and then relate to them in a different way where we allow them to be as they are and not dictate what we're going to do or not do, that instead we really look to our values, who we want to be, what we want to stand for, the kind of life that we want, and make conscious, deliberate decisions to move our hands and feet and mouth, the only things we really can control, in those directions, instead of sort of being bullied by these difficult thoughts and feelings, then we end up with a life that's filled with more vitality and meaning and purpose, even though we may still feel like imposters
Mm.
at the same time.
That always strikes me as such a relief, that I don't have to get rid of these things that are difficult and that I know don't make sense. And that also, and I'm guessing you can relate to this, but if we set up this idea of like, here are things you can do to stop feeling like an imposter, and then they don't work, then it's like, wait, who am I? I can't tell people how to do this because I'm still having these types of experiences. But
Exactly.
you're very open about sharing that you still have these kinds of thoughts, right? It's not like
All
they
the time.
right. Yeah, we don't
Yeah.
solve them. And God, what a relief that we don't have to.
I could not agree with you more, Seth. I think that that is like the biggest gift of relating in this way is that relief of like I can let go of this struggle. I can accept that like these kinds of thoughts and feelings are just part of being a human being, but they
Mhm.
don't have to decide what my life looks like. I tell most of my clients, and often when I do talks, etc., that I've been practicing ACT and psychological flexibility for over 20 years, and I'm more anxious than I've ever been in my life. And I have an anxiety clinic. So clients are coming to me because they want me to help them get rid of their anxiety. And they're like, wait, what now? They don't like
Uh,
that. But the reason, of course, is because I am brave and I live boldly and I do things that I never in a billion years otherwise would have done if I was waiting around to feel confident and certain and to get rid of my anxiety. I wouldn't have written one book, let alone three. I would never have done a TED Talk. Things that, of course, you're going to be anxious about because the stakes feel high and you care about them. So, yes, I'm more anxious than ever, but I also have more meaning and purpose and vitality. And I feel proud of myself and just energized. And I love my work and I love my life in the midst of having more anxiety, but it's anxiety like that I choose
mm,
rather than the difficult feelings you have when you're missing out, or when you're living in your comfort zone. Comfort zones are comfortable for the short time, but it's not where growth happens and it's not where the magic happens. And then you're sort of left with the feelings you have when you're not living the way that you really want to be
mm.
living.
One of the things I love about your description of these things now and also in the book is that, as you just described, you draw heavily on ACT, on acceptance and commitment therapy. Listeners to the podcast may have heard I had a couple conversations with Steve Hayes, and in our most recent one, we talked some about maybe this was offline, but this idea of unbranding things, that we don't have to call things, and I did not do this in my last book, which is called Mindful Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. But we talk about so many similar things, and so many different approaches end up coming down, to a few very helpful techniques or ways of thinking. And psychological flexibility is a big one, and I really appreciate that you didn't call this, ACT for imposter syndrome or something like that. That feels very kind of siloing, like, oh, this is about
Absolutely.
this very narrow thing, and it feels much more just like a human approach that anyone can do. We don't have to call it, this therapy name.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's more about the process and what we can do. And it's just it is obviously I'm biased, but it's I've been living it in my own life for a long time, and I've seen what it's done for me. I've seen what it's done for clients, and I agree with you. The longer I stay in this field, the more I think we're all speaking different languages, but we're all saying the same thing at the end of the day in
Right.
some way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
like how can we effectively manage the stuff that shows up in ways that allow us to thrive and live our best lives?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember reading the first chapter of your book, and when you alluded to that idea of like, guess what? We're not going to try to get rid of it. I just felt that that relief we were talking about a minute ago,
Yeah.
of like, yeah, of course, of course. That's the thing about good ideas. It seems like they seem obvious, even though it's like,
Right.
oh, right, yeah, I didn't think of that, but it's obvious.
Yeah. I know. Yes, that is the first time when, when Steve Hayes talks about what we were talking about earlier, that like you said, where does it show up the most? And I said, well, where we care the most. That's an idea I heard first from him, where he said, we hurt where we care. And it was that, and he's not the first to say it. I've heard, I think Sharon Salzberg has said, many people have sort of had, but it was the first time I heard it. And I thought, oh, of course. But it was mind blowing at the
Right.
time. It just had
Yeah.
never occurred to me before. Right. And now I never miss an opportunity to talk about this with people, that, you put your hand on a hot stove, you take your hand away when you're in pain, and that prevents a dangerous burn. And so then we just think we're supposed to move away from all the kinds of pain, including emotional pain. But that actually seems to be the opposite case. Sometimes fear means you're in danger and you should fight or flee or freeze to be safe.
Yeah.
But lots of times these are false alarms. And in reality, these difficult emotions are telling us we're exactly where we're meant to be, that we should be leaning in to these moments rather than running away.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of the distinction that you make in your book between certain types of thoughts that we can dispute in a helpful way versus ones that we try to dispute and we just end up spinning our mental wheels. Can you describe that distinction? Like
Yeah,
how do we
sure.
know, like, this is a thought that I could actually follow through to some kind of resolution?
Right. So I think, at least when we're talking about ACT and psychological flexibility, what we care about is whether something is workable, meaning, is this moving me in the direction of my values, who I want to be in the life I and so, with traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, we are taught to change thoughts that are unhelpful in an effort to hopefully make us feel better and do the things that we want to be doing. And there is certainly evidence that this can be effective. And so some of the examples, I think the example I give in the book is, take if you're sitting in traffic. Most of us can relate, whether we're in our own cars or someone else's car or on a bus, we can relate to that feeling of sitting in traffic and thinking, oh no, I'm going to be late. Where are all these stupid people going? Why isn't the traffic moving? And that's the kind of thinking, and you get tense and you're feeling stressed out. Maybe you're anxious about being late. And that's the kind of thinking I think lends itself quite well to going, okay, hold on a second. It's just traffic. I will get there when I get there. It's not the end of the world. Being mad about it isn't going to make the cars go any faster. And that might help, regulate your nervous system a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. And maybe it will make you less likely to be honking and flipping people off and swerving and driving in a dangerous way. But it doesn't seem to be the case that that same strategy works quite as well with these deeper, like, I am inadequate, I am a fraud, I am not good enough stories that seem to be a universal part of being a human being. I happen to think if they're universal, again, evolution, there must be some reason for them, and that they're meant to protect us. They keep us on our toes. They prevent us from experiencing failure and humiliation and rejection. They just don't do a very good job. But I think that's what they're meant to be doing. And, if I sat here, if you said to me that you didn't feel good enough and you were mediocre and average, and then I listed off everything on your CV, that anyone listening to me would go, yeah, Jill, you're right. He's wrong. He's extraordinary. Your brain isn't going to go, yeah, Jill, you're right. I'm pretty cool. I'm pretty special. I really have accomplished a lot in my short time on this planet. Your brain's going to go, well, yeah, but this, and yeah, but that, and very readily supply just as compelling evidence that you're not as good as you think you should be. And so it just tends to backfire.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And even, I've done what would you tell a friend in your position? The person can easily say, like, well, I tell them, that they're very accomplished and there's nothing wrong with them, and they don't have to think those bad things about themselves. And then, if you point out, like, okay, so what's different about you? You can even, it doesn't tend to be like, oh yeah, you're right. It doesn't
Never.
work. And also it can have this effect of like, oh, I don't know, like there must be something really wrong with my brain, that like what's wrong with me that I can't see that? Because I get what you're saying. It's an obvious inconsistency, but now all I know is that I'm inconsistent. Like,
Right. So I should feel better about myself, and I still don't. So I'm even more broken than I thought I was.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe I just have to try harder to think better and to think more positively. And that, and it can get into this cycle, I think, of like, maybe I'm just not doing it right or not trying hard enough. And then you're just so caught up in this struggle, this battle that you really don't ever end up winning.
Mm. Well, Jill, I'm really happy that you've offered another way for people, for people you work with, your readers of the book, the articles you write, people who listen to conversations like this, that it doesn't have to be that way. It's not that you don't have to feel like an imposter, but feeling that way doesn't have to control your life or hold you back from, the life that wants to be lived through you.
Yeah, that's it.
There are tons of metaphors that are really creative. The clouds versus fog metaphor, I think, is lovely. I'll leave it
Thanks to my children.
That's right. Yeah, I know. Kids are little Buddhas, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Yeah. But so many things that I know readers are going to be able to relate to, and things that helped me to become more aware of my own experience and patterns, and things that I just kind of taken for granted. But you've really offered a valuable lens for seeing those things. Where can I send listeners who want to learn more about you and about your work?
They can find everything on my website, which is just jillstoddard.com. My podcast is there, my newsletter, my books, social media, the whole 9 yards.
Great. Well, I'll include that link in show notes for this episode, as well as a link to your books.
Great. Thanks so much.
I really, yes. And thank you for, again, for all that you're doing, and really appreciate your willingness to talk with me today. And I think some of the questions I asked you might have been a little tough, but I appreciate your thinking through those things with me. And so thank you again, and thanks for a great discussion today.
Yeah, thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone you know who might find it helpful. It's one of the best ways you can support the podcast. I'd also be grateful if you could leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. I'd love to get your feedback. I release new episodes every Wednesday, so if you subscribe, you'll get the episodes as soon as they're available. If you'd like to become a supporting member, please visit sethgillahan.com/podcast-membership. Your support helps keep the Think Act Be podcast ad-free. And thank you for listening.